so this is a follow-up interview with Maria Cartegena. This is April 28th, 2014. Thanks so much for taking the time, Maria. So let's get started. So first I wanted to go back to your early days as a community organizer, specifically your work with Palante. You briefly described the program, talked about teaching and learning from the children. Can you tell us more about how Palante was organized and what a typical day looked like there?
Okay, so you said children. I just want to make sure that it was kind of like preteens.
Okay.
So they were all in middle school. And Palante, again, I think I've said this multiple times in the video, is that, in the interview, is that, again, that was like another program that stemmed out of Nueva Esperanza.
Yeah.
And basically it was a cultural awareness program. So many of the students who were in this program would come there after school, and it was a program exploring the Puerto Rican culture. And many of the students came directly from Puerto Rico. And so it was really interesting for me to be part of this project because, in fact, I was born in the U.S. and grew up in the U.S. and knew very little about Puerto Rico. And so when I say that I learned from them was that, you know, these students really knew the rich history of important and prominent people in Puerto Rico, and I was learning from them because I had none of that history growing up in the U.S. And so what was interesting was that they would go to school, and after school this kind of became not necessarily a clubhouse, but it was definitely, there was safe space for students to vent. And many of so they would come in, we always provided a snack because we all know that the public schools lunch is delicious and students love it, and I'm being really sarcastic. And so they would come hungry, and so we'd provide snack for them, homework tutoring, and then we did some of the curriculum. And the curriculum was completely based on Puerto Rican history. And many times they would come to the program very kind of angry and disturbed, and so we would have to deal with what the issue was at the day. And many of them over and over again would talk about how they felt discriminated against, how they were having a hard time with teachers, how administration seemed to marginalize them and didn't treat them the same way that they would treat their white counterparts. And so really, even though the focus was to learn Puerto Rican history or to maintain that history, we would often talk about social issues that were happening in Holyoke. And so for them to be able to have a place where they can do that was really important to this program.
Can you tell me a little more about the motivation to found the program in the first place? Was there a specific event?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Holyoke has, in July every year, there's a Dia de la Familia Hispana, which is the day of the Hispanic family. And a group of community leaders really realized that as students, and particularly people like me who were born in the U.S. and grew up in the U.S., how we were losing our history and our culture and our traditions. And so the program was born out of the concern for preserving the history of Puerto Ricans. And so again, you know, it was in the 80s when there was a lot of prevention money. And so it was funded through the Department of Public Health in their community grant to be able to do that.
Do you have any specific memories or events that really stick out?
I mean, I think even to this day, I mean, this program was, 20-something years ago? And to this day, I will never forget, there's a couple students who just will always stand out. And one of them was this young man named Juan. And I remember talking to him about college, and you know, he was always like, oh no, you know, I don't know if I'm gonna go to college, like we can't afford it. And so talking to him through that process. But 15 years later, I ran into him at the mall, and he immediately recognized me, and he was like, Maria, and I was like, so I just, you know, he comes to me, he's hugging me, and I'm just like, okay, who is this person? And he realized that I didn't recognize him. But of course, he was a little kid, and now he's a young man. And he's like, you don't know who I am, do you? And I'm like, no, I don't, I'm so sorry. he was like, I'm Juan, remember me? Juan, Juan, come pan, que los pollitos se te van. There's a little kind of rhyme that Puerto Ricans teach their kids. And I was like, oh my God, Juan. And he was like, you know, he hugged me and he's just like, look, I just have to tell you that I graduated from Columbia University. And I would have never done that had it not been for this program. And, you know, those are like those priceless moments, you know, where you don't know the seed that you plant where it will end up, you know. And now he's actually come back to Holyoke. He's an entrepreneur. He's purchased a few businesses and has, you know, local young teenagers working for him. And so again, like for me, that's part of my legacy, right? And so it's one of those stories that I'll just forever take with me.
So similarly, moving on to your work going door to door in Churchill, what was the motivation for that initiative?
So that was under the Community Partners Grant, and basically there were 4 community organizers, and I explained this again, but working specifically in Churchill was because it was a growing Puerto Rican community there. And so some of what I have shared with you is that usually Puerto Ricans came to Holyoke, would live in the flats, and then moved to South Holyoke. But again, as social and political mobility happened for Puerto Ricans, then they slowly started to move into what they call the Churchill neighborhood. And the biggest issue in Churchill was the parks. And so I think residents were really concerned about what activities were happening in the park and what activities weren't happening in the park. And so I think we as community organizers worked with the residents to really empower them to take control of the park because it was such a big issue at the time. So.
And were there other issues that were also important, or was that really the main?
I think parks, and I think, and it's interesting that, you know, 20 years later, we're still looking at similar issues, but I think the parks and also the relationship with the police department was another thing that, you know, we held community meetings, so we could bring, you know, the police department and the community together. The other thing is just, you know, I mean, the community is always talking about needing jobs, you know, people want to work. And so the creation of jobs was really important as well, because especially during the 80s, that's when most of the manufacturing jobs were already leaving. And so many of the Puerto Rican families that were moving into Holyoke could not find employment through those means. So those seem to be the biggest issues for the residents of the Churchill neighborhood.
And when you talked to them, what was the general mood or sentiment? Optimism, anger?
So, I mean, back in the 80s, one thing that I learned from community organizing with Carlos Vega was, you know, 80% of it is listening and 20% of it is talking. And you would be surprised at how much people are willing to share when you door knock, because the reality is for many people that might be the only time that someone knocked on the door and asked them, what do you think is happening in the neighborhood? What are you concerned about? And so people, you know, again, I think I shared this before, people would open the doors and like offer coffee and cheese and crackers, and, you know, as someone who grew up in that community, you know, you have to do it, you know, you have to take the time and you have to listen. And so yeah, I mean, people were really open to have those conversations and come to meetings, because that was the way for us to kind of build neighborhood circles. And so that was the kind of entry point to really establishing relationships with people in the neighborhoods.
And from there, we went and talked a lot about your contemporary work and what you're doing now. But I'd like to go back and sort of say after, or what ended that initiative, or how did it end, and what did you do after that?
So what ended it? The lack of funding, prevention money. I think, again, in Massachusetts specifically, a lot of the money that was being brought in through particularly the tobacco industry, that money all ended, and state money ended. At one point, I think I shared this, was that Holyoke had 9 of the state and federal initiatives that were out there. And Holyoke had 9 of them, and they disappeared. And that was actually something that many residents talked about, was this sense of a program starts and then a program closes its door because it wasn't sustainable. And so, yeah, I mean, I basically left, or the program ended, and then I would be unemployed, and then I would go work at the next community organization. So, but always in Holyoke and always with adult learners or youth. So, and what I did next? I mean, I've done a lot. I don't even know where my resume is, like super long. But yeah, so I think I did, after that at Nueva Esperanza, I worked at the Community Education Project, and I worked with this initiative around trauma and learning for adult basic ed students who were non-traditional students. And so, yeah, that was like my next job after that. And then after that, I'm not going to remember. And at some point, I landed here at the college.
Yeah,
so.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you'd like to talk more about the adult learning initiative.
So basically, this program, I was part of this larger institute for a year, which looked at domestic violence particularly, but the impact of violence and adult learners. And so we were part of, it was kind of a research project for this woman named Dr. Jenny Horstman, and she was really looking at how to create spaces for adult learners who had suffered trauma, basically. And so we piloted a program, like I said, for a year, where we worked specifically with 5 women who had identified themselves as either survivors of domestic violence or who had experienced childhood trauma. And basically we looked at what were their learning styles, created a really welcoming space where we actually had like a little corner that it was like, we called it the trigger corner. And so once these women were either triggered by something that they read or something that was happening in the classroom, they knew that they could just get up and walk out, and that no one was going to ask them a question or, are you okay, or yeah, and it was a whole year of kind of learning how to work with those women. But again, for me, learning from those women was more important. I mean, they definitely taught me a lot more than I could have ever taught them. So that was the kind of experience, and it was really great. It was a core of really strong women who really wanted to learn, and they either wanted to learn English or when they wanted to get their GED. And in the beginning, there was always, attendance issues. But as the group got stronger and the group just really came together as one, worked together, the women wanted to be there, and it was really interesting to see the trends in the attendance. So towards the end, they didn't even want the project to end. And so, getting them together, and I think even after the funding for that particular project ended, the women on their own met for like an additional year. So again, and their lifelong friendships that were established through that project.
And so what do you make of the cycle of projects being started, being funded, and then the funding just running dry?
I mean, for me, again, this is very, I don't even know what the word that I want to use is, but it's part of, I think, a cycle that has kind of created some apathy in Holyoke. These many social service programs and nonprofits that are established in Holyoke have these great projects, and then they do end, and that's kind of a tragedy. As a practitioner, one of the things that I've always tried to do is to create community beyond the project. And so one of the things that I have always done is, many times when I've worked in groups or brought people together, I always want to make sure that it's not Maria's group. right? And so I remember a group of women, again, a different group of women that we were working with, and there were like 2 women who I kept in contact with from previous projects. You have to remember, like, I'm from Holyoke, and so I have these long-lasting relationships with people. And so this group of women, we came together, we were trying to, do some political work, and again, this is another group that, like, we ended up meeting for 2 years, and we only had funding for, like, to come together, like, for 3 months or something. We got some seed money to bring the women together. And I think part of it, for some women, for some of the people who have been involved in projects, they have been really good. And I always say that, like, I'm kind of a billboard of some of the nonprofits in Holyoke, right? So I was a teen mom, I went to the care center. I participated in WIC, which is the Women, Infant, and Children, is a federal program that helps women and their children. And so, like, I could be a billboard for all of these programs. And I think for many people, it's like what you gain from it and what, how do you move on? And I think for some people, a lot took advantage of a lot of these programs and were able. I mean, you interviewed Darlene.
Yeah.
Darlene's a great activist. And again, the same kind of stuff. She was part of many programs, many projects. She learned a lot of things. She went on to Mount Holyoke. So they are good. For some other people, it doesn't work that well. And I think part of it is because of access. So Darlene and I have been very fortunate that as we've moved on, we've then created networks and access to things that I think other people in Holyoke don't have.
Yeah. Okay, so if there are any other programs that are things that you've been involved in the past that you want to bring up?
I mean, I continue to be involved in things. In fact, right now we're part of this, I've been invited to be part of this group that is sort of an underground political group. So no one knows who's been involved in this project. We meet. One of the great things that I love about this project, and I decided to get involved, is because it's not affiliated with any nonprofit. Mm-hmm. We are meeting in people's basements and church rooms, and it's kind of like, it reminds me of going back to the basics of community organizing. Mm-hmm. And we're developing an agenda, and the agenda is how do we move the Latino agenda forward in Holyoke? How do we get Latinos to run for public office? How do we get our voices heard? Particularly right now, Holyoke's going through this rebranding of the city of sorts into this arts economy. And for us, is how do we make sure that our community is included in that conversation? Mm-hmm. And what takes place and what initiatives happen. Holyoke's about to hold an auction of properties. And so for us, it's like, okay, how do we get the word out so Latino businessmen and Latino artists know that this is happening so that they could be at the table? Mm-hmm. And yeah, I mean, I'm really excited. We've been meeting for 2 months, but the people that are meeting are dynamic and incredible, and I'm really looking forward to seeing where this grows. But what we have decided is that we do not want to establish a nonprofit.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell me a little more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone that's involved in the group has access to, political networks or social networks or money. And so we don't need to be affiliated with any particular group or nonprofit, right? We can do community organizing and community information dissemination without necessarily being attached to any group. And I think we want it that way.
So that ties into my last question for you. And we've touched on it a bit in both of these interviews, but what is the legacy that you imagine leaving for future generations?
Oh my God, you're gonna make me cry. I mean, I think this is is why I now do the work that I do on campuses, because I think that in very privileged campuses like Amherst, I think students aren't aware of some of the struggle of communities like Holyoke. And I want students to understand that when they go into a community like Holyoke that has been labeled as dangerous, or the Puerto Rican community is lazy, or they're all on welfare, that they understand that theoretically what they're learning, right, and systematically policies affect communities like Holyoke in manners that students sometimes may have never understood, right? So for instance, an example of that is, education. You all are here in a very elite institution and get this incredible education. But the education that you got from K through 12 allowed you to have access to a college like Amherst. And in Holyoke, 50% of our kids do not even graduate high school. And that's based on, the system in which schools get funded. And I think sometimes students in Amherst don't get that theoretically, but don't understand it experientially. And so to connect students to community and understand, kind of walking in people's shoes, kind of to say, is important for me now. I want to challenge academia to think of community as experts, and also communities as assets and not deficits. I think that's now the reason I do the work that I do on campuses, is because I really want students to understand the resilience that exists in a community like Holyoke, and then particularly in the Puerto Rican community. And so, I think that's my legacy.